To start as people are still coming in. So hello, and I'd like to welcome everybody today to this session, another event within our series of webinars jointly organized by ISO and UNIDO on countering the impacts of COVID-19 with international standards. My name is Dorina Nati from UNIDO, and I will be moderating the session today. The webinar today will focus on managing risk and building resilience in the context of the global pandemic, but also beyond that, and how international standards can be used as a tool to support these efforts. The session will start with some introductory remarks by my dear colleague, Mr. Johannes Dobinger, Chief of the UNIDO Independent Evaluation Division, and will be followed by a presentation by Mr. Jason Brown, expert in risk management. We will then have a question and answer session afterwards. So the attendees are encouraged to please put their questions in writing in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will then choose the relevant questions and pose them to Jason after his presentation. We want to apologize in advance in case we will not be able to answer all your questions, but we will try our best. Also, to let you know that this session today will be recorded and the recordings will be made available to the participants afterwards. For more information on this particular session, but also on other sessions, on previous sessions within the series and upcoming sessions, please refer to the UNIDO Knowledge Hub under hub.unido.org. Well, having said that, I don't want to take more of your time, and I'd like to hand the floor to my colleague, Mr. Johannes Dobinger, the Chief of UNIDO's Independent Evaluation Division. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dorina, and thanks again for inviting me to be here and say a few introductory remarks. When you informed me about this webinar on managing risk, building resilience, I found it very interesting. I'm working for UNIDO's Independent Evaluation Department, which is basically the other side. No, we are looking at what our colleagues in UNIDO do in technical cooperation to promote things like standardization, quality, improve products, protect consumers. And standardization, we know, is in many of the projects that we assess and evaluate. And we noticed in our evaluation practice that, of course, the COVID pandemic has generated a lot of interest now in risk management and in topics like resilience, increasing resilience, so that the next time the things like the COVID pandemic hit, we are better prepared. From an evaluation point of view, in our work, we are well aware of the importance of risk. When we assess projects, we normally do not look only at what the projects do. In order to explain the success of a technical cooperation project, we also need to know what happens in the environment of a project. And how we describe the environment is a lot determined by the risks that are out there in the environment. So we are used to assess risks when we evaluate. And to give you an example, things that we discover, we often see that if you design a project that promotes renewable energy, it might depend a lot on the oil prices. So a risk that is out there is that the international developments lead to a sharp decrease in oil prices, and that would probably make eliminate the feasibility of your project to promote renewable energy because it becomes relatively too expensive. So we are used to look at risks, and that is why we find this kind of renewed interest in risk management of real importance for organizations like UNIDO. And we appreciate that these kind of initiatives happen between UNIDO and ISO to promote new tools. And this, I think, what we will learn from Jason. I'm very much looking forward to listening to his story about the ISO tools in the field of risk management and resilience building. And without further ado, I again thank the audience for being with us today. Thanks, Dorina, for inviting me, and I give back to you. Enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for setting the scene for today. Indeed, we're all very interested to listen to Mr. Jason Brown during his presentation. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce to our audience, Mr. Jason Brown, who is the National Security Director for Thales in Australia and New Zealand. Thales provides services for aerospace, defense, transportation, and security markets. And Mr. Brown is responsible for international trade and security liaison with government, law enforcement, and intelligence communities to develop cooperative arrangements to minimize risk to Thales and those in the community that it supports. Mr. Brown is internationally known speaker in the area of risk, intelligence, security, innovation, export, scenario, and strategic planning. And we are very, very pleased that Mr. Brown is here with us today. And with that, Mr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dorina. Sometimes I think you're talking about someone else when I get introduced because I don't feel like that. So I have a presentation for everybody, and I've tried to bring together a range of material, particularly relevant to the pandemic, but also I'm going to use that to look at the context of managing risk for major disruptive events. But I will take you through the international standard for risk and the concepts that sit behind resilience. So I'll just do my screen share opening, and hopefully it will all work for you, and you'll see me in the corner of the screen as a little head. There I am. So the title I was asked to speak to was about countering the impacts of, in this series of countering the impacts of COVID-19 with international standards. There have been other speakers, but I think when we think about risk, we have to think about managing the decisions and managing the uncertainty around events and their potential consequences, which may be for good or bad. And Johannes, there's an interesting comment about looking at, say, renewable energy versus oil. You can have unintended consequence by pursuing a particular objective, and those consequences may actually undermine those objectives. So when you think about risk, you are balancing a whole range of possibilities and likelihoods. And so using a methodology, and particularly some of the vast assessment methodologies that are available, which I'll touch on, you can find your way through very, very difficult circumstances and decision making. So as we go through, that's me. I'm not going to say any more about myself. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's me down there. And if people get excited by what I have to say, if you send me a note on LinkedIn and you reference this, I will say hello and put you into the network that I've got. So if you're interested and you enjoy it, let me know. I'm putting up something about viruses, and while if you haven't got a big screen, you may have trouble reading this, you will be able to get the presentation from UNIDO because I'll provide the full presentation to them. These are two things about viruses. The first one, avian flu, a HN type virus. We learned a lot from that, and what we didn't really think about, and this is global, we learned a lot about that 2003 through to 2006. Then again in 2010, we also had a major influenza period finishing off. And WHO have done a great job in documenting this. So if people want to understand the risks associated with and how it's managed, my own review of the World Health Organization approach, I find it very positive in the way they consider the collection of data, the assessment of consequence, and how they look at risk and how they understand global and national vulnerabilities. That model, I think, is good, but I don't see it repeated often in national levels, and I think that's evidenced by how things have occurred. The next slide I want to look at is, again, SARS. And why I'm showing these, I'm not going to go into details around them, I'm showing these to you because we knew all this. We knew the potentiality for these things. one of them we were really lucky with, Middle East respiratory syndrome, a zoonotic transfer from animals to people. It was lucky that it was camels, the dromedaries, that carried it, and they were limited to certain countries. But in those countries, not the scale we're doing today, 858 deaths, but it was 35% of patients died. Here in Australia, we have an equine mobility virus that transfers from people on rare occasion, but like some of these other viruses, carried by bats, transfer to the horses, and the horses give it to the people. We have very strict monitoring and controls, but at one point, all the horse racing and the transfer of horses across country was banned. And that's a small thing compared to what we've gone through. But the issues around it are well known, and the strategies to reduce the impact are well known. So as we move forward, this is a very important document. I hope many of the folk on this call look at the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report every year when it comes out, and it changes things because it analyses it. But without being critical of the WEF and their methodology, they don't take enough of a longitudinal look at how things develop in terms of the history behind them. So I'm going to show you 3 of their reports, and you'll see I've got 2 circles. Infectious diseases being identified down there, and this is the place on their risk matrix of the global risk landscape in terms of the issues of impact on the world economic situation and the likelihood of occurrence. And you'll see in 2000, this report was written before COVID, it is there. Now, it's still high up as an identified major risk vector, but I want to look at where it was in previous years, and we'll see how that goes. Okay, so in the document, you'll see where I've circled progress against pandemics is being undermined by vaccine hesitancy and drug resistance, making it increasingly difficult to take action. Now, that's actually wasn't the problem that we've seen. If we analyse what's happened, it's political posturing, failure of leadership. It's the vaccine stuff isn't the problem. The scientists are doing incredibly well. So while the World Economic Forum identified pandemics as a potential major risk vector, their understanding of how it might work did not reflect here what the global situation was in respect to preparedness and resilience. And I'll talk about that a bit more. But as I go through how risk methodology works, you'll see that this is a mistake that very many people make, and it's not a criticism of WEF, it's a symptom of not developing your risk assessment methodologies very well. So now here's some previous years that they've changed their diagram, but it looks similar. Notice in 2007, pandemics is still higher than it was in the 2020. So the further you are down in the bottom corner, the bottom left-hand corner, and the further you are to the right-hand corner, that's the greater the level of potential impact and risk. Now, you'll see in 2010, it's way up there. And that was because they were influenced in their risk methodology by what I'll call primacy and recency, the level of global interest in terms of who's paying attention to it, and the recency of the event. Those aren't actually very good indicators of a likely risk event. So this is something they've also done. This is a correlation matrix, and I put this up because I've put the words connect the dots. The thing they did identify, which I think was really important, was central to managing this would have been cooperation between the United States and China, and we definitely did not get that. We actually got the reverse. And they noted the role of working together was critical, and I think the WHO have identified that. But if you look at that map, you'll see while they had, this is pandemics there in this interrelated map, the heavy lines are showing the impact on other risk vectors. And you'll note pandemics only has light lines. And I think that represents a failure in modeling and a failure of understanding the consequential related risk outcomes when you look at it, because let's have a look at some of these things. The pandemic's impact on the deficiencies, the pandemic's impact on liabilities, the pandemic's impact on food, and so on. So I think there's some really interesting aspects there in terms of when you break down the systems through a high impact event like this, you need to have done much more modelling than this modelling represents. So they do something I think is really positive in risk management, which is when you've got a degree of uncertainty, you do some modelling about what may happen. But again, the things you need to think about when looking at that modelling are very, very much around what factors you take into account. So they noticed something that I think was really important given the current pandemic: infodemics. Information that was distorting the event, the movement away from science to conspiracies and other things. And this was something they identified as part of their process. So back in 2008, they were identifying some of these issues. When they did this analysis, and when you get the slides, you can read through it or look it up on the WEF website, they looked at a model roughly around the same period of our pandemic, but stopping sooner, because they envisaged that there would be issues around herd immunity, etc., which of course actually the science is now telling us don't happen in the way that they expected. So they thought that some of the states in Asia would suffer worse, but it's actually been the reverse because of the independencies of the structures that COVID affected in terms of access to work, hospital overloads, etc. They were actually more apparent in the West, and I think it's really interesting that many Asian countries who had experienced SARS, swine flu, and others were better prepared and more resilient in responding to it because they didn't have the interdependencies. So another thing that's interesting, this modelling that they did in 2008 looked at a full-blown epidemic with 1 million deaths worthwhile, how it operated, that it took, they had a partial vaccine after 3 months. That's pretty terrific, but they couldn't distribute it. That's very optimistic, but their death toll that they estimated was 1 million deaths. We can see what this was a couple of days ago from the World Health Organization, 1.39 million deaths. And let's look at today, 1.4 million plus deaths. And this is the distribution. So even a group is integrated into an understanding of how the world works, has difficulty doing it, but their modeling was pretty good. And of course, that was 2010 modeling. The probability of an event like this was no different in 2019 than it was in 2006 or 2007. And you know what? The probability of having another one in 2-3 years' time or less is probably the same. So this risk management tells you that you have to have preparedness, planning, response capability, and build transverse resilience across all your enterprise, because you actually can predict these events will occur, but not when. So you need to be in a constant state of preparedness. By building an integrated model, you can start to say, okay, we have this fantastic new model for response in our hospitals, response in our transport system. So it actually doesn't have to be a pandemic that's threatening. It could be a response to some other global issue, breakdown in the, for example, in the atmosphere, increasing solar radiation and cancer. You might then have to think of how you treat people. So any global event needs a resilient and risk-based modelling to understand what might happen. So this is one I sort of threw in. Hopefully some people here have heard of electromagnetic pulses. They happen, and some of them have happened in the past, some of them happen currently. We haven't had a mega one, but we have moved from a position of a major one that occurred in the late 19th century, where the impact was minor because we weren't in a telecommunications type society. Today, if you had a natural electromagnetic pulse from the sun, it could take out most of the world's satellites, GPS, and so on. And when you think of the interrelationship between SCADA systems to manage pipelines, so I don't know the measure of what countries are doing to build resilience against a natural electromagnetic pulse, but we will get one. We've had them before, the Carrington events there. So it's just really amazing that this information is there to tell you about a potential catastrophic event, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to start to look at the treatment and controls, but it needs leaders and managers to think about these things and then build resilience into their systems in the face of any potential event. So here we go. Okay, that's last one. So let's look at this. This is a model, and I'm calling it risk architecture. It'll apply to any country or any enterprise, and conceptually it's derived from work done in standards that clearly governance is important. Who leads, who manages, who has authority, who's accountable. But for them to be best informed, and for everyone else in the various layers of an enterprise, organisation or country, they have to manage the risks that are relevant to the objectives that they want to achieve. And in doing that, they need to look at their operational activities, and that could be anything from their agricultural sector to a small industry making chips for computers, etc. And you need to think about the factors that actually might relate to your capacity to work on these things. And I think it's really important to look at culture, to look at resources, look at the infrastructure and so on. And you need to look through those lenses all at once, because if you just come up a stovepipe, your business, your nation, you need to look at the interrelationships, hence the Venn diagram in the middle of that document. So this is derived, this set of circles is derived from the international standard 31,000 guidelines on risk management. And there are three components. You'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, leadership and commitment. It goes to my issues around governance. You will not get good management, and particularly good risk management and good decision-making and good outcomes unless you have leadership and commitment to the decision-making based on an understanding of risk. And you need to integrate, design, implement, evaluate, and improvement. Joanna will be pleased with the evaluation bit there. But ultimately, you do this to create value, whether it's societal value, business value, global value. And there's more of the components that you need to consider in terms of thinking about this, human and cultural factors, but very importantly, best information. But sometimes when we're talking about major events, there's high degrees of uncertainty. Hence, we use the concept of uncertainty to help define risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And I use objectives as a very broad term. That could include goals, missions, even vision and values. So in the standard, these things are defined, documented. But the one I'll draw your attention to is the actual process map. And you'll see that down in the bottom. Now, why do we have arrows and circles? It's because it is not a one-off process. The circumstances you're in, your context, your environment changes all the time. So when we look at the risk management process, we start to look at how we will actually analyze the risk that is in our, I guess, purview of activities. So let's move on a little bit here. So I've talked about these pillars already: principles, framework, and process. You can see summaries of those online, but we actually have implementing standards for this. We have standards about managing risk for travel. We have standards for managing risk about legal risk. We have one that's under development on looking at emerging risk and so on. But the actual standard itself, republished in 2018, takes you through those three sets of activities. And I've talked about this one a little bit, 8 principles, and each of those principles is described in the text. So for those of you who want to look at risk management, unlike some ISO systems, it is not a compliance system. It's one where we argue that your enterprise, your endeavour, whether it's a government department, the United Nations, or a small business, looks at these concepts, principles, and process and can operate and integrate them in the way they want to do business. But these are a guide to the thinking and methodology that you need to apply to support decision-making. So I've talked about this again. Everything is about leadership and commitment if it's in an enterprise. If the board of directors, the secretary of a department, the ambassador in an embassy doesn't believe in this, even if you do, you'll struggle. So convincing senior leaders that this is important is a critical task in getting risk management accepted. Now, in today's world with issues around data protection, more consequences for boards of directors in private enterprise for their decisions, impacts of things like anti-bribery legislation and the consequences for boards whose companies get involved in that. Leaders and board members and government people are looking to this sort of modelling to provide them with the information they need to make those high-level strategic decisions. So a typical example here in Australia, right now, we've got a major review of our critical infrastructure protection, and the core document for assessing risk is the ISO 31000 standard, and it's used across all the government agencies and many, many businesses to provide a framework to develop how risk is managed in their enterprise. So this is the one, there's a typo there, sorry. This is the one that I get excited about, is the actual how to do it. So integrated, and I've used the word customized already. So each of these components in that circle doesn't happen in a linear way. When you've started your communication and consultation and all the things you need to make that effective, as you learn things through the process of developing scope and context, identifying risk, you realize there are other things you need to communicate and consult on. So this is an interactive system. So there are three components there: communicating, consulting, monitoring, and all the subsets, and of course reporting and recording. So you understand what it is you're managing and doing in your system. This is the bit where it gets really important. What are you trying to achieve? How are you trying to achieve it? And that's where scope, context, and criteria comes in. And they can range from the decision to do a multi-billion-dollar merger with another company through a decision to open a new shop in a business district. So your scope, context, and criteria are relevant to what you're trying to achieve. And similarly, once you do the assessment, what have you got in terms of value and assets? What are you trying to achieve? Who's going to make the decisions? Will people have access to what you're doing? Will there be loss or potential damage? Are there criteria, and so on? And so you need to think about these sort of variables. Some of these ones in this particular slide was designed for looking at employees, for example. So you can develop a risk methodology around what you're trying to do by way of your achievements and objectives. And you don't start with what the problems are. You start with what you're trying to achieve, and you look at the scope and context of that. And as you go through risk identification, you're looking at threats and vulnerabilities. You should also be looking for opportunities, but risk is not about one or the other. Risk has all of them embodied in it. And what you do when you manage risk is you analyze the various likelihoods based on the information you gather of a threat occurring, and they could be a natural hazard, or they could be a criminal threat, a terrorist threat, an human-initiated threat, which of course in this model is very important because humans can respond and change. So you're in an adaptive regime. And I could talk for days about how you need to do that. And it's a little bit different from hazards risk assessment, which you often see in environmental and medical areas. So I've touched on that one already. There we are. One of the things that people do in manage risk is they look at how you decide what you're going to invest in it. And you also decide, are there risks that are intolerable? And then you need to look at what you have to do maybe at great cost. In a general business, you'll make a judgment on the basis of probability of the problem occurring or the probability of the level of achievement of your objectives. And you'll determine a level of practicability that allows you to say, I'm going to put up with these risks because the cost of really stopping the problems that might occur or stretching to the highest level goals of our objectives is too expensive. So I'll live in a balanced environment. But ultimately, you should be bringing risk down to a level where any lack of certainty about your decision, the issues of vulnerability and threat are so small that they're managed by the routine components of your business. Now, here's a whole list of standards, and there are many more. If you want to build risk and resilience, there's guides in many international standards that'll help you. You'll see I put ISO 31000 at the top, and I've called them the core. There's lots and lots of committees in international standards, and there's lots of standards. But these are ones that particularly go to dealing with the sort of incident that the pandemic's occurred. But of course, all the other ones about communication, cybersecurity, and all of these other ones that sustain business, they're all important as well. So when you look at that enterprise model I showed you at the start, you can use relevant international standards to give you guidance or direction on what you've got to do in your enterprise, be it private, public, international, such as the UN, and you can pick through the standards that are relevant to the objectives that you've got in your system. Now, this is a quick little drawing. You can't read all the writing, but these are some standards that are very important. 9001 people are very familiar with, which is quality systems. 45,000 is about safety. 14,000 is about environment. And I'm currently, in addition to my other activities, convener for the supply chain security. Every single one of those, and 27,000, you can see probably in the corner there, is the information and telecommunications security standards. Every one of those has risk involved because you have to assess what you're going to do in each of them. Risks-based decisions around the environment. What are the threats? What are the vulnerabilities to that environment? In safety, what are the dangers associated with accidents and design of the environment in which people are working and so on? All of them need to have a risk methodology applied to them. And in critical infrastructure, the things that sustain society, from food, communications, finance, etc., energy, all of those things actually have to be managed with an integration of standards and work practices that build resilience, which is the next bit of what I've got to cover. And I'm very conscious we're moving along. So I had governance in my chart. Governance is about who is accountable for making the decisions, who holds people responsible for what they do, generally the highest level, the top management of an organization. It could be a board of directors, it could be the minister of government responsible for that activity, it could be a secretary or head of a government agency, it could be the chief medical officer, depending on their activity. But they need to anticipate. And risk management, if done using the model in 31,000, you actually bring anticipatory issues around vulnerability, threat, and hazard, and objectives and opportunities to look at, anticipate what might happen. So when you have a situation like the pandemic, all the information was there from multiple previous pandemics, all the guidance on planning was there. What was missing was the willingness to anticipate and respond to that anticipation by bringing people together by consensus, holding people accountable, transparency in the decision making, and being responsive, effective, and efficient, being fair, and importantly inclusive, and being lawful. I think I could go through many countries where at least 3 or 4 of those were failed by government and entities. I don't need to pick any out. You can use your own imaginations as to the countries that failed to anticipate, failed to develop consensus, did not have clear lines of accountability for who would do what. I can say Australia, I'm Australian. We had one state where we had major problems where we had escape of infection out of our special hotels where we're holding people for their quarantine period. When that was examined by a Royal Commission, which is the way we do deep dive investigations in Australia and Britain, and Canada, for example, they found that no one was clear about who was accountable for all the decision making. And mistakes were made because people were making decisions without understanding their own accountabilities and responsibilities, not with ill intent, not even, these are very clever people, but mistakes were made about the implementation. And it comes down to the leadership did not address these points. And this is from the UN. There's other examples and other points about good governance which you can find, but I picked this one up given this is a UNIDO event. Resilience comes from doing a whole lot of things. Resilience isn't a process. Resilience is an outcome from doing a lot of other things right. The interaction of the attributes, cultural, behavioural, belief, etc., the activities and operations, the technical scientific areas of experts, all of those come together to build resilience. So when you want to have a resilient enterprise, you need to look at how these things integrate. The other thing about resilience, which people really need to think about, resilience also has in it what I call adaptive capacity, because the world can be unpredictable even with the best risk management, the best scenario modelling. So therefore, resilience is most important when you have an adaptive capacity to respond to changes, particularly unexpected changes. So the principles are about enhancing behaviours, an understanding of what your organisation's context with. And I use organisation in the broad sense there. I've already mentioned governance. And now what's really important is diversity of opinion, knowledge and experience. So when the people managing a major event or planning for one don't include the stakeholders, they lose knowledge that they need to have greater certainty. So diversity is really important. And there's studies going back in Europe, 2004, 2005, of successful companies who weathered very, very extreme financial events, social events, etc. And they had some characteristics, not the ones you'd think that you design a good company, which is high profitability, etc. They were ones where there was good communication. There was a culture in the companies where people signed up to the aims and visions of the organisation. There was strategic leadership. So these are what I call soft subjects. They're not the hard things like you've got what you have in business continuity, say, an alternative IT space, you've got redundancy in your pipelines. Now, these were people issues. So I wouldn't hesitate from relying on that. And essentially, you don't get resilience unless you have effective risk management. So it's an organisation's ability to absorb and adapt in a changing environment. And that resilience is increasingly important in an incredibly complex world where there's high degrees of uncertainty, high degrees of volatility in your operating environment, and there's an abundance of information that's hard to manage. And that actually adds to uncertainty. But if you keep that definition, ability, which is the way you do things, organisation is a general term, absorb, that is take the hits. You know, if half your staff are ill, how do you absorb that damage to that resource? And then what do you have to do to adapt? And I actually am very positive about what's happened in the world when I've looked at how countries have adapted using technology to accept that working from home can sustain us and has been sustaining us quite effectively in terms of keeping the wheels of industry, the wheels of finance, the food supplies, the supply chain, etc., has actually been operating incredibly well considering the nature of the disruption. And a lot of it comes down to communication, but it comes down to a willingness of decision makers to adapt very quickly to tools that they weren't using. I would be interested to know how many of the people here had never used Zoom before last year. But now I think probably everyone in the world is using it or its equivalents. So there is an organisational resilience standard. It is very much focused on business style organisations and derived from some of the learnings that we've done from business continuity. But it looks beyond that and identifies some of the characteristics. So they use future-proof business. I don't think there's such a thing as future-proof, and I didn't approve of the language when they used it. But having said that, by building an adaptive capacity, a learning organisation, and attributes and activities around how an organisation works, there's some really good guidance in this standard. And I teased James, the convener, and telling him he's just a businessman, but he's put a lot of thinking and vision into this with his team of people. So I'm now at that point where I look like I might hand back to Dorina. So I'll close off my screen share and she can start to organise some questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. It was a very interesting presentation, and we got a lot of feedback from our audience and a lot of questions coming in. So I think I hope everybody could already benefit from the presentation, and we will try to address some of the questions received. One thing that you mentioned, you talked about modeling and anticipation a lot, and a lot of questions that we got relate to how can one prepare or anticipate something that is far beyond your imagination, like a global pandemic, which for many SMEs was not necessarily something that could have been foreseen. So what are the ways to deal with this?
Look, there's a number of people that call themselves futurists, but the ones who come from the business and academic domain are quite good at this. So Dr. Richard Hames, many years ago, was employed by Royal Dutch Shell to do that forward horizon scanning. And he ran a series of scenarios that postulated if the oil price crashed or Middle East oil was not available. So by postulating a scenario, no matter how unlikely, you can start to say, if we're in this situation now, what was the pathway that led us to this? What events happened? What are the trends that are happening that would indicate that particular pathway to the future? So one of the easiest ways is if you have a good team of people around and they're prepared to use their imagination, you imagine in the context of your operations 4 very different worlds. I have my own modelling, which I've done for everything from the Museums Association to our Defence Force. And so you might, for example, say, we are in a society where a particular nation that you work with has had a major social breakdown. And so your plans that you were developing for your oil business is no longer viable. Now, so you're saying 10 years from now, there's an autocratic government suppressing the people, there's revolutions, etc. What would be the indicators of that event coming forward? And then you might also say, well, actually, we have a reverse of that, where we have a benign operation where things are going really well. And then when you've worked through all of those, you'll find there's some things that you really should be doing that you need to do for all of the scenarios. Now, I very quickly tell a quick story because I think it's important. I love science fiction, not because it's escapism, because it challenges you to think about the way the world might be. In the 1950s, there were 3 books that were written that for me were very, they revealed possible futures that are now coming to pass. One everyone will know, but they'll know it by a different name. It was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? But most of you would know that as Blade Runner. It had human replicants, but it also envisioned a society affected by climate change. If you watch the film Blade Runner, it is set in a hot, humid society of megacities. Where is the world heading at the moment? Now, Philip K. Dick wrote that and a number of other books with that same dystopian scenario. So another author who I think is really pertinent to today's age is Isaac Asimov, a scientist in his own right, prolific writer. He wrote a book, the Foundation series, which envisaged what I would say is Google, but he had it on a global scale. But what your device does today, hey Siri, what's the distance from the Earth to the Moon? Hey Siri, can you analyze this? So when you add AI to that sort of knowledge management capability, we now are today, other than the intergalactic travel piece, we are there in terms of, oh, my Siri's just answered me on my phone. I kid you not. I found this on the web. What is the distance from the Earth to the Moon? Siri, can you answer? That's because luckily I turned the sound down, people. But can you imagine that 20 years ago? But he imagined it in the 1950s. And the last person I'll mention who envisaged the future was a man who called himself Cordwainer Smith. Cordwainer is a shoemaker, old-fashioned shoemaker. He was actually a senior special operations officer in China during the war, but he came to Australia on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency, but he was more interested in writing science fiction stories. And he wrote stories about genetic engineering and human-animal cloning to create an underclass of servants, etc. But what was really interesting was he didn't focus on the science, he focused on the consequences for humanity and its relationships. So here we are, many years later. Stephen Hawking died not so long ago. I had given a similar speech about the future where I said the three great opportunities and the three great threats are genetic engineering, climate change, goes without saying, but particular issues around climate change I was addressing, and lastly, AI and autonomous machinery. That is machinery that is not only there using AI analytics, but moves around and talks. So, the worst case scenario is you have human animal clones and horrific experiments going on with no total lack of ethics, or you have life-saving capabilities. In terms of AI, you have a capacity to manage all sorts of data to derive learning from them, or you have Terminator, particularly when you add it to movable machines. And of course, climate change is with us. But what will climate change do that if we're working on it now and we can't get the right answers in terms of change? Are we thinking about how we'll manage Australia in the future, how we'll manage the east coast of America, how we will respond to the 50 million refugees who will occur if we have a half-metre sea level change? Now, that's not science fiction. That's based on observable indicators that we have now. So that's to answer the question. There's a lot of stuff out there that can do it. I've gone on a bit long, but I want to inspire people to think outside, not the square, think outside the Rubik's Cube.
Thank you very much, Jason. Indeed, imagination has no limits. And you rightly referred to science fiction, where we have seen a lot of things that today are reality. But certainly there is a cost associated that comes with imagination and profoundly creating a base for this. So science and assessing risk and also managing risk. And this puts a financial burden on a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises. So for SMEs, in particular, those in developing countries which already struggle with their resources, how can they meaningfully manage the risk and be more resilient to external shocks?
Well, I mean, I think there's risks that you're capable of addressing, and there's ones you aren't. But I think there's ways of doing it. I mean, certainly when I see people working together across boundaries is really important. So I've got historical models I can use, but so much comes down to what is the culture of how people relate together, and my daughter, who's a great world traveler, once said to me some of the happiest people she ever met were people in very poor villages in central Mexico, and they managed their lives within the constraints of their lives and found joy and happiness in their families, etc. The only problem for some countries that are still developing and small and medium enterprises is the infrastructure around them doesn't enable them to achieve their vision. And that's often about political leadership, social issues. And you manage those risks by finding ways through things. Sometimes the most successful are those that operate outside the strictures of government. I'm not recommending that. But I think where you can form relationships to achieve goals, I think it's really about that. Just on the BBC today, there's a section about in Venezuela, a group of people who lost their tourist industry, but rather than sell out to mining, which they know has a finite life, they went back to their old ways and recreated their village environment, but they're sustaining the tourist facilities with the view that that will come back. Really, and that's how you think about this. You think differently. You might have to change your objectives. You might have to be adaptive. And I think those are the sort of things that I'd be saying to a small or medium enterprise. But it's hard. It's not easy.
Thank you, Jason. And also talking about managing risk and how far to go in anticipating and managing. We see now that due to the restrictions that we're facing with the global pandemic, we moved into a different mode of working. So we work remotely. While this seems to work relatively fine in many areas, in others it's more challenging. So, and there another risk is created that comes from the action that actually mitigated the risk in the first place, or that responded to.
Oh, look, absolutely. Consequences of loneliness, despondency, lack of affiliation. And depending on your personality type, if you're an extroverted person like me, you get your energy from being with other people. And therefore, someone with that attribute finds this more difficult than someone who doesn't have that attribute. But again, there is no such a thing as something that's totally advantageous. All things have consequence. So it's a question of deciding on balance. Can I live with the consequences of this action? You might decide to increase your business potential, but there'll be risks in that if other external factors that you haven't taken into account affect your profitability and so on. So the really important thing is, and why we put those arrows around the risk diagrams is, depending on your operating environment, you need to have, we use the word, have your antenna up. You need to be really conscious of the things that are changing that you can do something about. And in fact, also be prepared to make decisions to change direction totally if there's enough of those indicators to say the course you've chosen isn't going to work. But when it comes to pandemic, we can actually predict pretty well. If you talk to the psychologist, we could guarantee there was going to be a rise in domestic violence. We could guarantee there was going to be a rise in drinking. How you prevent it is, well, in some places they limited the amount you could buy from a liquor store. You know, there are solutions, but it's a question of will and willingness. And you know, without naming countries, people wanted to relax too soon, and all the evidence was there from their, you know, as Biden said, listen to the science. You know, listen to the science.
Yes, indeed. Jason, you also mentioned that resilience is a consequence of doing things right, so of managing your risks rightly. And in this regard, still there is a standard for risk management and there is a standard for building organizational resilience. So what is the difference and how do these two standards complement each other?
Okay, well, when you read the standards, you'll find there's cross-referencing into 31,000, because in order to build resilience, you need to analyze through a risk lens the things that you do and the things you're trying to achieve. But there's some things from a business continuity perspective that you can do and think about. Look, I'll give you an obvious one. When I was first working with Thales in Australia 16 years ago, we had one major computing site. That was a vulnerability. Now we have 3 sites with full redundancy in Australia alone. There's a cost to that, but when you look at the statistics of the cost of losing your computer networks, something like 90% of businesses that lose their computer networks and information in them go broke within a year. So, you know, whether you're a small business that has two PCs, one's a backup for the other, or you put it in the cloud, that's building resilience for that part of your component. And so whether it's an electromagnetic pulse and your cloud provider is protected, hopefully, or you get a virus in that computer, if you have backed up your system on a regular basis every day, you may have a week's damage to your business, not your whole business. That's just a simple model. And you can do that for your premises, your electricity supply, and you do what's reasonable. I go back to that upside down pyramid that I had. What is a reasonable amount that you can sustain with the resources available to you? It might not be enough if you have a mega event, but it will deal with a lot of the events. So you build resistance by looking at all the things you need to do. But ultimately, I come back to people every time. It's people who solve problems. So if you're a small business with 5 staff, how do they engage with you? How do their lives impact on your business? And I think that's really important.
Indeed, it is very important. And I would like, as we're slowly running out of time, I'd like to end this presentation with a positive statement or a positive note. So from your perspective, from a risk management perspective, what do you think is the thing, or what do you think we win or we learn from this crisis?
Look, I think we learned from this crisis that we have to think more broadly about how the world interacts. The greatest lesson for me about this is we are in an absolutely connected world. National posturing and national boundaries are quite irrelevant. because a virus doesn't recognise national boundaries. A solar flare doesn't recognise national boundaries. Climate change doesn't recognise national boundaries. So when we think in global terms, this pandemic, one would hope, but I'm pessimistic that it may not, given that SARS and others didn't. This one probably, because of the impact, will make a difference. But you know, I've been calling on world leaders to say, be world leaders for God's sake, for someone's sake, because it comes from leadership ultimately. The UN, I look at the UN SDGs, sustainability goals, etc. This is admirable stuff, but you need a Merkel or someone who brings their country along that way. And when I look around the world, you know, I have reservations about it. And when you have a major world power that doesn't subscribe to, I guess, what the international commonalities, I don't care which world power, you can choose any number, that will prevent us getting the benefit that we might get from this. Now, being optimistic and all, I'm hoping WHO gets strengthened. I'm hoping the medical fraternity, the transport fraternity, and others start to say, we really need to think about how these infrastructures work together to sustain humanity. And I don't mean that in a prosaic sort of way. I mean, actual, do the customs organisations in the International Customs Organisation sit down and say, how do we, if this happens again, enhance transfer of goods to reduce the impact of untimeliness, for example? That the Royal College of Surgeons in London and the CDC in the United States create better exchange programs and better sharing of knowledge than they currently have. So that's the sort of thing that I'd be looking at to build resilience in those core systems around infrastructure, around knowledge, around transport. They're the things that this is telling us, and some haven't failed. Let me tell you, the non-public transport, the transport of goods, has not suffered anywhere near as much as might have been expected, because the transport folk have realised they've got to sustain that sort of delivery. So I remain optimistic a little bit. I think we are capable of addressing these issues, and I think using some of these standards that I've mentioned will help small enterprises, even individuals, think about what they're trying to attain. But certainly for companies, businesses, councils in small areas, it's all good stuff.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think thinking outside of or beyond national boundaries, this is a very good final message, and using standards in order to manage our world better in the future. I think with that we can close the session for today. Thank you very much, Jason, for having been here with us today. Thank you very much to all the attendees that followed us and that interacted through their questions with us. We hope that we could address your questions and we gave you an insight into the world of risk management and resilience. For more information on this session and on the other sessions, please refer to the UNIDO Knowledge Hub, hub.unido.org. More information on UNIDO's work and in the fight against COVID-19, you can find on the UNIDO website, unido.org. And more information on ISO and ISO standards can be found on the ISO website, iso.org. I have put this information in the chat for all the attendees. I'd like to mention also that we will share the presentation and the recordings of this session with everybody afterwards. So with that, thank you very much. Jason, thank you very much, everybody, for being here with us. And I close the webinar. Thank you.